Hello and welcome to an extra special edition of Jorgy'S Stripping the Dipping. I'm your unusual co-host, the formidable F1 Blag, and I'm here with a friend of the show, a podcaster himself. I would say the breakout F1 Twitter star of 2022, but that's just me. Bryson Sullivan, welcome to the pod again. How are you?
I'm doing quite well. How are you today?
I'm okay, yeah. I mean, not to get into too much detail, but today was my older son's 8th birthday, so we've been on our feet with a little children's party this afternoon. But yeah, so happy, extremely happy. And how are you feeling? Welcome back to the show. We've had a fantastic month of F1 car launches, and I'm sure we'll get into that today. But what's been keeping you busy over the last few weeks?
I actually haven't been as busy in the Twitter and F1 space as I would have liked to be in the past couple of weeks, but I have been keeping my eye on the launches, and there are definitely quite a few things to talk about. We have been still working on the Tech Heads F1 podcast and trying
Mm.
to get some new episodes coming out soon, and also extending that to YouTube and a few other platforms. So there's definitely a few things in the works.
Fantastic. Well, looking forward to picking through all of that. And if you guys have not checked out the Tech Heads podcast, and I'm pretty sure you will have by virtue of the fact you're here, but if you haven't, do check it out. Bryson Sullivan and Dr. Obbs, two for the price of one. I enjoy the episodes myself, and I can't wait for you to dissect. You'll have to give us a sneak peek today, but then dissect the 2023 runners and riders. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to digging into that in a lot of detail. But maybe what we should start off with is just looking at the major stories of the day, and then some of the major
Hmm.
things that came out of the launches.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we sit here, we record this in sort of internet land on Saturday, the 18th of February, which means that we locked in our final car launch, which was the Alpine, just 2 days ago. And I don't know about you, and let's pick up the FIA later. I feel like we need to warm up into that one. But I feel like the big story this week has been around. I think the desperate hope of Mercedes fans for the car to be something that gives Lewis Hamilton in particular, but also George Russell, a platform to really compete this year. We saw the launch. We saw an aborted track day, if we can call it that, due to a little misfire in the engine, something to do with it being mounted improperly on the chassis. And then we saw the car get out in some wet weather, which I don't know, Bryson. You've probably had your eyes glued to some of that wet weather running and the vortices that you can pick up around the mid to rear of the car. So talking of that Mercedes launch, perhaps as a starting point, what's your major takeaway from the W14 and Mercedes so far?
Yeah, there's actually so much to talk about. I kind of want to go in reverse order, starting from that vortices question and the wet weather running, and then
Mm,
circle back to talk a little bit about the launch itself. One of the things that I have to caution people about whenever you look at spray to analyze aerodynamic flows, there are at least three different things that are important to keep in mind whenever you see this. Number one is that water droplets are not aerodynamically neutral, which is to say they don't actually follow the actual flow around the car precisely. There's a number, a non-dimensional number called a Weber number that kind of relates inertial forces to surface tension forces and various other factors. But because of these factors, looking at the spray of the car is not always a faithful representation of what the airflow is doing around the car. That's the first thing. The second thing is when you do see the snapshot of spray coming along the side of a car, you see a beautiful swirling vortex pattern along the floor edge. It's just so enticing to analyze. One thing to consider is the actual quality of that image that you're seeing is a function of both the aerodynamics of the car, but also the water condition, the wetness condition along the track. And the variation in that wetness can cause a lot of variation in the spray that you see from moment to moment. A related point to that, and this is kind of a photography thing, is the shutter speed of the camera, which is to say the extent to which it freezes the action or averages it over time, depending on how fast or slow the shutter speed is. can give you a very, very different perception of what the image actually looks like of the flow around the car. Now, I've seen plenty of images that show what the W14 looks like as far as the flow around the side of the floor edge, and then other images of the W13 that seem to look slightly different. And then the inference was drawn that, well, there's some qualitative difference between these cars based on these two images. Whereas if you look more carefully, you can see that the image from the W13 was at a slower shutter speed. And so it was averaging out a lot more of the flow features than the more recent image of the W14. So I just want to emphasize that there are degrees of caution that you should add whenever you're trying to analyze these things. And the final thing is that the car isn't really running in the actual high performance condition when it's doing a shakedown. It's on wet tires on that second day, and it's significantly higher off the ground than it would be in actual race conditions. So we just have to be have to have a slight break on the extreme analysis of flow patterns, although they are exceedingly beautiful. One thing I will say about the launch, the livery was slightly spoiled a little bit early, which is fine. It happens to almost every every team these days. But it's a striking that Mercedes actually decided to go with the black livery. It's not striking from a technical perspective because we know that 10 kilograms of weight loss is roughly 3/10 of a second per lap. There's a huge amount of time to be gained by stripping away as much paint as possible. And we saw that with other teams on the grid this season. But the thing that's striking to me about this is that livery was initially put on the car on the W11 as an anti-racism message for two seasons, the W11 and W12. And after the third season, Mercedes corporate kind of made the decision they wanted to be more about action than statements, even though those are not mutually exclusive. They seem to want to go back to their Silver Arrows lineage. But the fact that the car became black again and they completely reversed course on their 2022 statements tells me that they are extremely serious about the performance of the W14 and actually mounting a challenge to Ferrari and Red Bull in 2023. So it's the engineering motivation for doing that is very obvious, but I wanted to just highlight how much of a 180 it actually is for Mercedes to go back to the black livery. I think it actually bodes well for the season.
So, I mean, a wise man once said one day ago, no earthly idea if the W14 is fast, but she looks mean and motivated. Um, yeah, for those that are not F1 Twitter aficionados, this was Bryson himself on Twitter. The point you make about the car being sort of perhaps not at the ride height that it will be at when raced in anger, it was something that I spotted, or at least the front wing looks certainly much higher than I would expected it to look. Obviously, the black livery means more than this is carbon fiber, and I think we all understand. Many of us that sort of lived through 2020, the summer of 2020, the challenges, the social challenges that sort of threw up, and we'll recognize that. Do you take anything away from perhaps, I don't know, has Lewis had something? Do you think he's been in the ear of Toto or the team more widely? To me, it feels like everything he does is motivated and deliberate. To use one of your adjectives from earlier, what do you think on that front?
I mean, there's no question that Lewis's actions in 2020 and in the years previously, or in the years after, sorry, in the years after that, there's no question that Lewis's influence will have a profound impact on that team at every level, not just at him personally, but in the leadership and the corporate structure. Everything about that team has been revolutionary in a sense since he kind of became the front member of it. And there's no question in my mind that re-emphasizing that message is a part of the explanation for what was being the decision that was made, but we can't deny the engineering and technical benefit of losing that amount of weight from completely stripping the paint off of the car except for matte black paint in a couple of areas. And I've heard numbers anywhere between 6 kilograms and 10 potentially in terms of how much weight you could lose from that degree of exposed carbon. So there's no question in my mind that the thing that Mercedes hates more than anything else is just losing. And as I said before, the fact that they're able to completely reverse course on their previous position indicates that they are extremely serious about it. Now, to be clear, the message of anti-racism is still there, and it was front and center even in the launch of the W14 itself. But we just have to be clear about what the primary motivation was. The primary motivation was an engineering performance benefit.
No, absolutely. And it was really interesting. Toto sort of linked back to the history of the silver arrows, and as you'll know, and many of our listeners will know, the silver came from the aluminium sort of car, having been originally white, but having the paint scraped off it to lose weight back
Well,
in
one
probably what, the 30s. Go on.
one thing I must have to say is that
Yeah.
that particular story has been fact checked by people who were smart, who have been smarter than me, and
Yeah.
I would refer to that particular story as mythology. I don't think
Okay.
there's an actual physical basis in historical fact. However, this is an opportunity to have mythology become reality. Right? We are actually in a situation where the precise same motivations that gave the story of the silver arrows to begin with, that's actually becoming a reality in the modern era. And modern cars are made of modern materials, carbon fiber as opposed to aluminum, as you say. And it's an opportunity to really live the legacy of Mercedes, even though it's not what they originally intended.
So life imitates art, perhaps, you may be saying.
Precisely. Precisely.
So we, you're one of our biggest friends of the show. The amount of boosting you give of our channel with your fantastic following, we notice it. We're grateful. Another friend of the show is Brad Philpott, and you know where I'm going to go with this. He I think grabbed maybe 1 or 2 seconds of an onboard of Lewis, where there seemed to be a bit of juddering, a bit of bouncing, you might say. Can we uh, can we draw anything or draw any conclusions from those seconds? Um, does the car potentially already have a bouncing problem, or is it far too early to tell?
Uh, Brad's decision to post that video in the form that he posted it was unfortunate. I think there's no question that if you watch the entire video in context, it's clear that the car is going over a bump in the track and it just has some oscillation as a result of that. But it's not a speed based, ride height based, porpoising issue that we saw previously. There are some rumblings around that not only was there an issue with the engine on the first day, but there may be some lingering things with the W14 that are being worked out on the way to testing in Bahrain. But porpoising doesn't seem to be one of them. It seems like in social media and certain times of the year when the fan base and the community is expecting to see something, when the community is expecting to, have their worst fears confirmed, all you have to do is give them a snippet of it and they'll they'll eat it up. And to Brad's credit, in his own replies to that particular tweet, he says, for the record, I don't think there's actually a real problem, et cetera, et cetera, kind of walking it back a little bit. But the damage seems to have been done. I can't tell you how many YouTube videos I stumble across saying definitively Mercedes has a horrible porpoising problem. They're starting off on the wrong foot, et cetera, et cetera. So these things are not trivial. And as I said before, there probably are some issues that the W14 has that are being uncovered as time goes on. We haven't gotten into the technical aspects yet, but they have a completely redesigned suspension setup, and there are some very unique aerodynamic things going on with the car. So I imagine that they will discover things about it as time goes on, but the traditional classical porpoising issue just isn't one of them.
And I think as we're recording this, I'm looking at the F1 website, and it's called, the testing is called the Formula One Aramco Preseason Testing 2023. The clock says we've got 4 days and 11 hours to go, and it feels to me that after those 3 days of preseason testing, we'll have much more evidence to go on. But I'm not going to be an easy host here, Bryson. I want this clip of the episode to be a time capsule. If you had to put your money on the W14, is it going to be another lawnmower or a wheelbarrow, or whether it will have perhaps a little bit more competitiveness? What would your gut feel be?
So there's an old saying in aviation that if it looks right, it flies right. And I think that there's an analogous feeling in motorsports as well. Some of the most successful cars we've ever seen are iconic, both in their liveries but also in their designs. Something about the W14 strikes me as being very well engineered, well thought out in a way that the W13 just didn't. Obviously, in the wake of Abu Dhabi 2021 and seeing the W13 car launch, everyone was hoping for a giant killer machine that was epic. But even then, there were some concerns that I had about that particular car, and the key thing was actually about the bodywork and the side pods, not so much in the zero pod side pod concept overall, but just in the degree of guidance that the flow was being given over the rear third of the car. It seemed to be totally unconstrained in a way that was slightly concerning to me. Again, the caveat is I don't have access to their CFD and their analysis, so I can't say anything definitive. But when you look at the W14, for example, and its curves and ridges, and the way it sort of seems to have shoulders and muscles, I've described it as a track weapon. It looks very well engineered, and there are some features that I expect to see on it in Bahrain that we didn't see in the shakedown test. You may have already seen them on the Ferrari front wing, but no, I think that the W14 is definitely a huge step forward over the W13. Now, to be clear, standing still in Formula One is going backwards because every team is going to make progress over what they did in the previous season. Again, we're only in the second year of a relatively immature regulation set. So all of the teams are going to gain time. The thing is, Mercedes is behind Red Bull and Ferrari in absolute pace, essentially. To actually get on par with them and to beat them, they're going to have to become better at essentially twice the rate that the other teams did. Now, to be clear, there's more to gain because the W13 was pretty far back, but they have their work cut out for them. And if any team can do it, I think Mercedes can.
No, absolutely. And I think, Mercedes were honest in their end of season. They did some videos with a few of the senior bods there that they had to actually dial some aero performance out of the car as one of their sort of quick fixes to the bouncing. So perhaps they can gain that speed. You did mention the Ferrari front wing, and actually, I'd be really keen to get your take on this. And for our listeners, my understanding is that I think it was the US Grand Prix last season. Mercedes turned up. They had some slot gap separators that looked like they were performing an aero function. The rules are quite interesting. You can break that down a little bit more for our audience there. Clearly, Mercedes decided not to run that wing competitively last season. And I think my understanding is they didn't want the hassle of a potential fight with other teams and the scrutineers. Ferrari have turned up with a very interesting front wing this season, which suggests that perhaps that is a legal interpretation of the rules. So Bryson, tell us, what's your take as we shift over a little bit to Ferrari of their car for 2023 and that front wing in particular?
What's interesting about this, and I'm not sure if you know the story, but I actually have a personal connection with that wing that Mercedes brought to Austin last year because I was fortunate enough to actually attend the 2022 USGP in Austin, and not only that, but I was actually able to get into the pit lane on the Thursday, and not only that, I was able to actually get to the Mercedes garage and over the rope and actually very near to the garage itself, and I was standing as close to that front wing with revolutionary slot gap separators as I am to my computer screen right now. I mean, if I had tripped and fallen, I could have broken it. So it was a revolutionary wing, and to be clear, I suspect that they probably weren't going to race that wing in Austin in retrospect, only because my understanding is that they didn't actually have enough spare examples of it to actually have it on both cars, but you need at least 4 copies of the wing. They only seem to have one or at most two. But the basic question that was at issue in 2022 was these slot gap separators. The reason why they exist is because no structure is perfectly rigid, right? And so as you build up speed and build the downforce, not only is the entire wing sort of pushed down or sucked down to the track, but the individual elements of the wing are sucked closer together. And if you don't put some sort of mechanical reinforcement there, the gap between the wing elements will close completely, and that will stall the wing, and it could potentially give you, even higher top speed. And so that's one of the things that the FIA kind of clamps down on. You have to have these mechanical brackets that prevent the slots from closing completely at high speed. Well, Mercedes figured out that you could actually have the maximum number of slot gap separators and, keep them within the geometric boxes that are allowed, by the regulations in terms of, minimum radii and maximum size, et cetera, et cetera. But you could use them for an aerodynamic benefit of reducing outwash. And outwash is extremely beneficial for the cars because it moves the front tire wake away from your car, but potentially onto another car. And the tire wake is tremendously turbulent. It has a significant energy deficit. And so it ruins the aerodynamics of your car. So you want to get it as far away from you as possible. Well, as it turns out, the regulations as they existed when Mercedes produced that wing are actually slightly different than the regulations that applied to the 2023 season. And in terms of the particular verbiage that matters, and the question that Mercedes decided not to have an argument over, was the slot gap separators in the previous iteration of the regulations had to have a connection between consecutive elements. They had to be a certain size, but they also had to have, and this is key, they had to have a primarily mechanical purpose, right? A primarily mechanical purpose. Now that's a very subjective description, but it was a question that Mercedes was going to argue potentially. There clearly was an aerodynamic benefit as well to the types of slot gap separators that they designed. But that's not what the regulations say, that it couldn't have any aero benefit. It just said it had to be primarily mechanical. And so ultimately they decided not to have that fight. And in 2023, that particular line of the regulations was removed. So everything seemed to be the same. You have to connect consecutive elements. There has to be a mechanical purpose, et cetera, et cetera. But this requirement to be, primarily mechanical is gone. And I think what I did when I heard that news is I went back to look at the old articles. As you might remember, I forget which publication showed it, but essentially it said that the FIA has made changes in December 2022 to outlaw Mercedes outwash, front wing design. And that was the headline. But if you actually go and look in detail at what the changes in the regulations were, it's exactly the opposite. It's exactly the opposite conclusion, which is to say the only thing that really changed was that single line about needing to have a primarily mechanical purpose, that's really gone. And so if you're clever when you read their regulations, what Ferrari produced is absolutely legal under the way that the regulations are currently written. So not only do I expect the Mercedes W14 to reintroduce those aerodynamically shaped slot gap separators, either in Bahrain for the test or for the first race of the season, I see no reason why every single team on the grid wouldn't do that. It's something that is objectively beneficial and a gray area that seems to have been opened up in 2023.
And I guess, leaning on your technical background, am I right to think that if all the teams, eventually deploy this technique with the slot gap separators, that it will be a bit harder? Or will that not have a dramatic effect on that particular aspect of the regulations?
I mean, in theory, it will be slightly harder to follow, but my contention, for the FIA has always been, if you think that outwash in general is a problem for the objective of the new era regulations to improve racing and to minimize the effect of the aerodynamic wake on the car behind, you have to be quantitative about how much of an adverse effect a particular design has. You remember Aston Martin's sort of armchair, sofa rear wing that they brought to the high downforce circuits last year. That was something that was allowed to race for the entirety of the season. And it was something that was, potentially creating some more outwash and some more problems. That it wasn't so bad that they banned it immediately. My contention is the FIA needs to produce some CFD on their end that quantifies how much worse the outwash problem is with this particular type of design. The teams can supply their own safety to help them in their analysis, but it can't be the case that we simply look at something and say, "Oh, that makes more outwash. It must be banned." Well, I'd like to know how much outwash is it? Is it something that we can live with that doesn't adversely affect the quality of the racing, but can still give us some performance?
I guess this all comes down to how well a governing body can administer a sport, which leaving that as a non-leading question, although it probably is a leading question. The effectiveness of any rules or the precision with which you can design rules comes down to how well you can enforce them and actually how well you can design the rules in the first place. So
Well, but I
let's
just want to
see.
say really briefly, I wanted to close that out because you're definitely
Yeah,
right about that FAA question, but you did ask me briefly about what I thought about Ferrari
go on. Yeah.
and their launch. So first of all, we've been suffering from an ailment in Formula One over the past few seasons. Increasingly, we've had manufacturers and teams for their launches, they'll either take out a show car or they'll show us renderings or they'll show us an old car in a new livery. And it's getting worse and worse over time to the point where fans are starting to get upset at some teams for, frankly, insulting their intelligence, right? And this is something that we definitely want to push back against. And what I loved about the Ferrari launch is that it was a perfect antithesis to that. Not only did they show us a real car at their launch, but they did the shakedown live in front of the world. I mean, the potential for disaster there is significant, but they were confident enough in their ability to put a car on track and to engage the audience. That was a live audience that was there with engaging hosts and everything. I mean, they actually showed us a real car on track. So that was one of the most brilliant things that I think I've seen in many years as far as car launches go. I'm not sure if it beats the Spice Girls at the at the McLaren launch back in the day, or whichever team it was. But in terms of a modern launch that was really the perfect antidote to a growing problem that we've been seeing, I was very happy about that. I was also very happy with Aston Martin. By the way, they also guaranteed us they were going to show us their real car, and it didn't disappoint. I know some people think it was somewhat conventional, but there's some radical things in that design that I'm looking forward to. But overall, no, I'm very impressed with the Ferrari design. Clearly, an evolution of the SF of the F-175. The most noteworthy thing of the front wing, besides the slot cap separators that we discussed before, is that Ferrari has detached the first element of their front wing from the nose. If you remember the F-175, the nose came all the way down to the very, very front of the front wing and it ended in kind of a point, and it had like a NACA duct in the center there. Ferrari has backed that off a bit so that the nose now ends on the second element of the front wing. And one of the reasons why that can be beneficial is because it produces kind of a slot gap effect underneath the bottom of the nose that allows you to get away with a slightly more aggressive geometry without the flow separating from the underside of the nose. And it's actually something that I was hoping that Mercedes was going to do in 2023. They haven't seemed to have done it yet, but it's a design feature that Red Bull has and Haas and other teams that I think is beneficial in terms of the flow around the car. But overall, I think I'm very happy with Ferrari. They did a live shakedown, which is something no other team has done, and they're looking very strong this year.
Course, it would be remiss of us not to recognise they have a new team principal in Fred Vasseur, who joined them just before Christmas. What do you think might be the impact of his arrival and indeed Mattia Bonotto's departure, if anything?
2022 was such a strange year. It was filled with a number of opportunities that I would not have expected to have. I went to the Miami GP early in the season, last season, and through a friend of a connection of a friend, I was actually able to attend an Alfa Romeo event and meet Fred Vasseur for about 2 seconds in downtown Miami. It was slightly awkward because I was still wearing a Mercedes hat, and that was a little bit weird at an Alfa Romeo event. But the impression that I got of him, honestly, was someone who was very competent, someone who was very well respected by the people in his team, but also someone who's just a very straight shooter, if that made sense. And the fact that Ferrari was looking to bring someone from the outside into their team, kind of like how Jean Todt came to Ferrari, in their sort of dominant era, tells me that internally they view something being wrong, not with their culture per se, but with the style and way that they conduct themselves, that maybe a pair of outside eyes would be able to identify and then systematically improve. So I definitely think that Fred Vasseur is a good person for the job that he's in. He certainly has his work cut out for him, but we also can't deny that he personally has not had any influence at all on the SF-23, right? That car is, in terms of design and the engine and everything else. Mattia Bonato's hands are more over that than Fred Vasseur's, but it's his job to bridge the gap, and it's his job to identify things that can improve and to actually do so. So I think that Ferrari being self-critical and recognizing that there are some things that it can improve to be a more lethal competitor, it only can benefit them. And so I expect them to be a very strong challenger this year.
Yes, well, I mean, from a neutral, attempting to be neutral standpoint, would love a competitive season. My view on the Ferrari last season was, yes, okay, Ferrari probably did have a few tactical blunders, that's to say the least, and certainly there were a few accidents from both drivers. But ultimately, I thought the RBA team was sort of head and shoulders above the field once we got to the midpoint of the season. Um, and that might be an interesting way to segue across to Red Bull. And their launch feels like a long time ago. But of course, in recent days and weeks, we've been hearing about the future, about Red Bull, Ford, and actually that the FAA won't treat them wholly as a new engine supplier in 2026. What have your impressions been since the Red Bull launch, or indeed, do you expect them to retain that kind of uh, most competitive position of all the teams as we start the season?
Yeah, Red Bull didn't really start 2023 on the strongest foot. I think if we were to take a gauge or a measure of which team launch the fan base hated the most, it would probably be Red Bull. I think Alpine might be a close second, but that's kind of a recency bias sort of thing. But as I mentioned previously, some teams were misrepresenting what they were showing on stage, and Red Bull was kind of the first offender of this, um, showing a reliveried RB18 and passing it off as the RB19, which was kind of problematic. But as you said, that launch event did bring Ford into the picture officially and recognize that Red Bull Ford powertrains is going to be a feature in 2026. It will not be granted full new manufacturer status, but if you look at the fine details of what the actual story is, they're still going to get 85 to 90% of the benefit of a new manufacturer. The only reason that they were not given new manufacturer status completely is because they had experience in handling and assembling the Honda ERS system, and that experience that they had can is directly applicable to 2026. I think people actually are underestimating how different the internal combustion engine is from 2020, two in the current era and 2026. We won't even have split turbochargers anymore in 2026. I mean, the entire architecture of the ICE is going to be inherently different. So there is a lot of work for Red Bull powertrains to do then that doesn't necessarily they aren't necessarily aided by any IP that Honda may have to the degree that people think. But no, they definitely are going to still get a lot of the benefits of a new manufacturer, not as much as Audi. Audi's going to get the full benefit, obviously, because they're really making a full engine. But it's just it's an interesting situation. I almost feel slightly bad for Honda in the way that they've sort of been not completely caught out in the cold, but it just really didn't seem to be the partnership with Red Bull that they were hoping it might have been. But to be honest, I think a Honda Red Bull partnership was always going to end earlier than people thought, partially because of the engine freeze and the entire reasons why we had an engine freeze. Not only was it to reduce costs and to make things easier for some of the smaller teams, but also to give Red Bull powertrains a chance to kind of build itself up and actually produce an F1 caliber engine and powertrain. And they never seem to do it. They seem to extend the deal with Honda. And even though the engines they currently use are badged Red Bull powertrains, they're designed by Honda, they're manufactured by Honda, and they are serviced by Honda. And that partnership can't really make sense in the long term, because if you had an engine freeze that was designed to assist, partially at least, designed to assist Red Bull in becoming a fully fledged powertrains manufacturer, and then it never materialized, the entire rest of the grid would have something to say about that. So it is kind of a complicated situation, but overall, I think that even if you give Red Bull a tremendous benefit in terms of 90% of being a new manufacturer, they still have an incredibly difficult job ahead of them to produce a competitive power unit in 2026. I don't think we should underestimate that.
Well, no, underestimating that would also beg the question why there aren't many other manufacturers queuing at the door to join Formula One. It's a tricky sport, particularly at the hybrid engine side. A question for you, and I know you're a rational guy. I'm going to appeal to your emotion here. We'll see how we go on. You hinted at this. If you look at sort of the conduct or the intelligent approach, whichever way you would look at it, of Red Bull and the engine regulations, even going all the way back to when they sort of fell out of love with Renault, and there was some backroom wrangling about where they would move to, through to the Honda deal, where they picked up, I would say, the peak of the Honda project, which obviously McLaren binned perhaps prematurely, and then obviously to RBPT, as they're officially titled, somehow wangling a way of having an engine freeze, which clearly, if you look back to the last 7 years, and an engine freeze would be disadvantageous to their main rivals. And now this Ford deal where, all but 10% of the benefit of a new engine supply, they're going to get 90. Do you think there's someone in Red Bull who's extremely intelligent that's playing this? Or do you think it's just luck that they always seem to come up, sunny side up from all of these regulatory changes and all these opportunities through the years?
You said that I was rational previously, and I think I would amend that to say that I'm aspirationally rational. That it doesn't always shine
Yeah.
through. But no, in terms of Red Bull, I mean, it would be naive to suggest that there's only one team on the grid that is pushing the limits and exploring in fine granular detail exactly how far you can get away with something to benefit yourself and your team. That certainly is a feature of Formula One writ large, not one team. But you are right; they do seem to be pushing the limits in some areas that is characteristic of a team. Part of that, I'm sure, has to do with the way that Red Bull thinks of itself as a disruptor in the F1 space. Red Bull does not manufacture cars. They don't have an OEM backing. Their purpose really is as a marketing exercise. But other than that, the mechanism by which they do that is to build race cars. And that's always kind of been their MO. So it doesn't really surprise me that they're, trying to cross the line. I think, the last season proved that they crossed the line a bit too much, especially in terms of their spending last year. So it doesn't surprise me that there's very smart people in Red Bull that are doing everything in their power to maximize their advantage. And to a degree, you have to kind of, to understand why they do this, it's not just the culture, but you have to understand what Mercedes has been and what Lewis Hamilton and his partnership with Mercedes has been. Mercedes has left their competitors, you know, crumbs at the table of competition for years. They've had to fight every season, no question, but they have been successful for so long. Teams are starving for success, and desperate times tend to produce desperate actions from teams. So it's not a total surprise to me that Red Bull might be doing these things. It's also not a surprise to me that Red Bull is well known for having extremely aggressive strategies, saving tires in practice so they can have access to them in the race, all kinds of things that Mercedes doesn't necessarily do. I think that behavioral pattern is an outgrowth of the environment in which the team has kind of found itself. They didn't always have a dominant car like the RB18. They had to be very scrappy to find ways to get any kind of advantage. And there are many fields of battle in which that takes place. Some of them are on the track, and then some of them are off the track.
Oh, for sure. And, pointing to the culture and perhaps even the origins of the team is a really sort of shrewd observation. Before we look at the rest of the grid, and this has been a fascinating episode so far, thank you, Bryson, for all of this. Which car of the three, so we've talked Mercedes, Ferrari, and now Red Bull, which car of the three will look most different since the launch when it turns up in Bahrain in a few days, and which car will look as similar as it could have done compared to the launch? Could you rank them 1 to 3?
Normally that's a dangerous game because that's presupposing what the teams have in store. But actually, Mercedes has told us explicitly that the car that we see in Bahrain is going to be really quite similar to the car that we're seeing we saw at the launch. Not only for cost cap considerations and a few other things, but they actually plan to have a major upgrade to the car by the third or fourth race of the season, which suggests to me that they're kind of non-committal about making major changes to the car prior to that. If they have this big change coming. One of the things that we haven't quite talked about yet with the W14 that I kind of want to spend a little bit of time on is that we've talked about the zero pod concept previously. And what I would say Mercedes has now is more of a half pod, right? It's like a 0.5 pod. And the reason why I say that is it actually is much more in line with a side pod that is it's actually somewhat thinner in the front, but it's wider in the back. It's much closer to a straight line from front to back. Whereas the W13 had like a pretty wide inlet and geometry at the bottom of the side pod, and then it swept aggressively to the center line as you went backwards. And I think one of the things that can improve in terms of the W13 is or the W14 rather, we've always had questions of this front tire wake and how do you control it? And if you can keep it outboard for longer and prevent it from getting sucked into the back of the car, the coke area, and the diffuser, so that the beam wing, things that really improve your performance, if you can keep it as far outboard as long as possible, overall, even if it doesn't give you better peak downforce, it can give you better average downforce. It can give you a wider operating window. And so I think Mercedes is definitely poised to build on that. And they have some things planned for the second or third races that are going to be pretty exciting. So I don't think Mercedes is going to be radically different. For the most different, I actually think it's going to be Red Bull. And the reason why I say that is because we still haven't seen any good images of the RB19. to this day, we still haven't seen it. We saw the RB18 at the launch that was allegedly the RB19, but we know that it wasn't. And we've seen some grainy video from their Silverstone shakedown. We don't have the luxury of still quality imagery like we had for the Alpine A523 shakedown. So we don't actually know what the RB19 looks like. I mean, we have some suspicions about the width of the side pods and how flat and wide the nose is, but we don't really know for sure. Those could be artifacts of low quality images. So from the perspective of what car would look quote unquote different, I think that the Red Bull will look the most different because we haven't actually seen it. we don't actually know what it looks like in any great detail. So that's probably the one that I'm looking forward to seeing the most. And as a side note, just remember, as I said before, I expect probably every team on the grid to adopt the Mercedes slot gap separator solution eventually, if not immediately.
Yes, and that might be an interesting, as you can probably hear my children in the background, an interesting function of how long it takes teams to develop that might be a function of how much cash they've got. Who knows? Speaking of cash, before we move on to hearing your sort of highlights from the rest of the grid and who you might think might be up there, clearly the cost cap for 2021 was breached by, from a procedural perspective, I think Aston Martin, and then obviously in a I can't remember the word. Apparently, it wasn't material, but it was a decent amount of money by Red Bull. Red Bull have 10% or 7% less wind tunnel time. Do you think that will already be affecting them now as they develop from launch to testing, or will that sort of cut in later?
First of all, that kind of a penalty, I think it actually ends up being more than 7 or 10%. We'll have to look carefully at the way it breaks down because it's compounded, but it's definitely a non-zero penalty. I think it will show up a lot more in next year's car and in the second half of this year's car, more so than the launch specification. Because remember, the first origins and the first, twinkle in the designer's eye of the RB19 probably would have been happening in Belgium, Spa timeframe last season, or even earlier. Because as we mentioned, the more dominant your car is, and the more secure you are in the current year's championship, the earlier you can turn your attention to the next year's car. And so I do expect them to have made significant progress on their concept, many features of which have shown up in other cars. But the cost cap benefit, or like the cost cap penalty rather, um, it will definitely affect them later on in the season as they try to continue developing the car. They may run out of the opportunity to manufacture new parts. They may have to modify parts instead of building new ones. As you probably remember, Mercedes, in several instances last season, they didn't bring new front wings to races. You could see the scars of where the old wing was modified and how it was manipulated. I mean, they might move the dive plane down a little bit, or even that Austin wing when they brought it to Mexico and they removed the slot gap separators, you could see the mark on the wing where they used to be. They're not making new wings. And so I imagine Red Bull will have to get a little bit creative about how they actually go about that. Let's not forget also that the actual level of the cost cap has gone down slightly this year versus what it was last year. And it will go down again in the next season as well, because we're trying to make the sport more friendly to new teams coming in. And then the final point, of course, is that Red Bull won the Constructors' Championship last season, something they hadn't done since 2013. And so, given that wide, period of relative lack of success, let's say, this will be the first time in a while that Red Bulls had to deal with the fact that winning the championship gives you less wind tunnel time and CFD time already, right off the bat. So not only is it the case that they'll have a CFT and wind tunnel, penalty from their cost cap infringement from 2021, but they're going to get less on top of that because of the sliding scale, and they were the first in the constructors. So I think that the way we should look at this is history kind of rhymes, right? When was the last time that we had a major regulation change purpose towards trying to improve overtaking? It was really 2009. It's really the last time I think of a major overhaul to the regulations purposed specifically to improving overtaking. The 2010 season, which was the season following that, was actually a pretty brilliant season, if you remember. Now, there was actually quite a bit of convergence on the grid, not only in terms of design philosophy, but also in terms of performance. And we had a very close championship, right up until the last races of the season. I fully expect something similar to that to be happening this year. This is the sophomore year of the current regulations. Teams have done their exploration of a design space. They figured out some of the wrong ways to build a modern Formula One car. And I think the modifications that have been made are only going to improve the performance of the grid on average. So the slowest cars won't be quite as slow, and the fastest cars won't be quite as fast. I expect to see some great racing this season.
I hope so too. And maybe as we think about the rest of the grid, perhaps a certain Vitaly Petrov, if we're comparing to 2010, might reappear in the paddock. Who knows? So, speaking of maybe Aston Martin, but actually the rest of the grid, who's caught your eye through launch season? And if you were to make a dangerous prediction, who will surprise us in 2023 from outside those big three teams that we've talked about so far?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think the livery competition is won by Mercedes. the audacity, the temerity to go with a almost fully exposed carbon fiber livery is stunning, and the car looks quite incredible. I think a close second place would be Alfa Romeo. Their livery is also quite brilliant. They have this beautiful shade of red that they use for their cars with kind of a candy coating that gives it a very good look. But in terms of how radical the designs are, I think I think the team will probably surprise people the most is either Aston Martin or Alpine. And the reason why I say Aston Martin is because people have looked at the launch car and seen a generally downwashing back end of the side pod and said, "Well, okay, that's very Red Bull esque. It's kind of similar to what they had last year. That's not really that creative, et cetera, et cetera." But to be honest, it's not until we saw some of the other images of the car when it was doing its shakedown at Silverstone, looking at it from above, you can see this. It's actually quite radical. It's actually like a hybrid of what Ferrari has done and what Red Bull has done. I mean, yes, there is a downwashing back into the side pod, but that's actually constrained to the outermost part of the side pod. If you look at the inner half of it, it's actually got a deep valley, a deep channel there, not quite as extreme as Ferrari has had, maybe closer to Alpine, but it's pretty radical, and it definitely does different things in that area of the car than Red Bull does. There are also some major changes to the way that the inlet is designed for the car, and the halo, and also something you might have seen a lot of the teams experimenting with is the cooling outlets for the radiators. We're seeing more of what I would call a cannon style outlet. It's kind of what Red Bull had and what McLaren had to a degree, where instead of having just louvers around the side pods to let the flow out like Aston Martin had early on or Alfa Romeo had last year or Ferrari, they keep that bodywork closed and then direct all of that airflow to these large openings on either side of the exhaust. And what's noteworthy about that is that has the benefit of guiding that low energy, dirty, turbulent air from the outlet of the cooling system. They can guide that right in the slot in between the rear wing and the beam wing. And the reason why it's beneficial is because if that dirty air from the cooling system impinges on the rear wing or the beam wing, it can cost you a lot of downforce. And so even Mercedes has developed this new system for this season with this cannon style cooling outlet that actually is a feature that we're seeing more and more of all the teams. And so I think that's definitely something that is the full effect of which we haven't really understood yet because not as many teams have were doing it last season as they are now. But in terms of who I expect to surprise people is probably Aston Martin, just because their design is more radical than people give them credit for. Is the first thing that I would say. As far as Alpine goes, believe it or not, Alpine made a really fast car last season, and the biggest problem that they had was reliability, and it was almost not entirely, but the lion's share of reliability was felt on Alonso's side of the garage. I believe that if they can cure their reliability ailments, the gap from fourth place to third place can be, bridged essentially. I think they have a very strong engine. It's just not very reliable. I also think that McLaren might be a team to look at as well, not so much in terms of how they'll perform in Bahrain, because they were very cagey about expectations and trying to dampen things down, saying that they weren't perfectly happy with every aspect of the car that that they launched and that they'll bring to Bahrain. But they have a good understanding fundamentally of what they're trying to do. And they have some things in the pipeline that they're very excited about. So by Spain or by Baku or Miami, something like that, I think McLaren might also make a big leap up. And then the final point that I want to say is actually not technical at all. It actually has to do with drivers. And I don't think we should underestimate how many points a bad driver can lose you. I'm not saying that Daniel Ricciardo is a bad driver necessarily, or Nicholas Latifi is a bad driver. I'm sure he's better than me, but they cost their respective teams a tremendous number of points last season. And even if you have a very fast car, if your driver can't get the most out of it, you're not actually going to maximize your performance. So on top of all of the wonderful technical things we love to talk about, ad nauseum, let's not forget that we have a slew of new drivers, Nick DeVries, Oscar Piastri, Logan Sargent, etc., who are looking to prove themselves on the biggest stage in motorsport. And I think they're a big factor in who we should look out for as far as making moves and moving up the grid.
Yeah, and that's an incredibly intriguing point. That I shout out Aldas, who we had on earlier this season. He's done a couple of videos about which driver pairings perhaps are the strongest, and where certain drivers may be under pressure for this season. And you're absolutely right. If you look back at last year, certainly Ricardo and Latifi, without naming any other names, maybe Stroll you could throw in there just about, weren't matching their teammate perhaps on race pace. Look, Bryson, your time is incredibly valuable. We want you to come back later in the season, but let me finish with one question, which is 2022. I think I knew you in 2021 on F1 Twitter. The Abu Dhabi sort of debacle was where I saw your name and account first. Then last year, you've become someone I see on my television networks on Sky Sports. You've launched a podcast, The Tech Heads with Dr. Obbs. You've been at Miami, as you talked about. You're in the pit lane in the paddock in Austin. What does 2023 hold for you? What could you reveal so far, or when might you be able to reveal it?
No, as I said before, the specific circumstances that made some of those things possible last season were not because I'm great or because I'm especially good. I was very fortunate to have friends that were very helpful in making some of these things more possible than they would have been otherwise. I'm not really sure what to look for in 2023, to be honest, because things are always in flux. I'm not a I don't have any grandiose plans for becoming this very active content creator per se. What I do know is that I love talking about F1, I love talking about motorsports, and I love exploring the details of this thing we call racing. And if I can continue to do that, I will try to in whatever capacity that I can. And I'm very grateful for the people that I've been able to meet, like yourself, Regina, Dans, and others, people in the space who are equally passionate about motorsports and about the community. And if I can contribute to that in any way, I will. But I can't give any firm statements about what the future holds because oftentimes you can't really see what it's going to be. But I am looking forward to the season. Very much looking forward to testing. It's not really clear to me exactly how things are all going to shake out. Just to prepare myself, I was rewatching some of the testing from last season, and I'm always amazed by how shocked and agitated the grid was when they saw the W13 for the first time in Bahrain because they feared that they had missed something major and they were going to be dominated. I wonder if something like that will happen again this season. Maybe not quite to that extreme, but I wonder which teams will look at a team or look at a car and say, "Okay, this is a threat." Maybe it's a W14, maybe it's not, but I'm certainly looking forward to it.
Absolutely. And I remember waking up, sort of being roused from my sleep by photos by Alberto Fabrega, I think it was, of that first glimpse we saw in the bright blue sunlight, bright blue skies and sunlight when we saw that W13. And sadly, it wasn't translated into on track performance until much later in the season. Bryson,
Yeah,
it's been a go on,
I,
please. No, go
I,
on.
I was just gonna say I just one final point.
Go on.
Everyone saw that car, and the way that I would describe the W13 is this is not to be derogatory in any way. It was undercooked. And what I mean by that is it was a very ambitious design, a revolutionary design, something that couldn't even really be copied by other teams, but it seemed to not have the amount of attention and detail and time put into it to actually translate the concept into reality. What I suspect and what the second half of 2022 showed is that Mercedes understands so much more now about what they designed than they did in 2022. I think there really is an opportunity for an evolved or fully fledged version of that idea to make its appearance this year in the W14. So I definitely think that there's some potential there that might throw people off in terms of what they were expecting Mercedes to do. They may even surprise themselves with their performances. But yeah, again, thank you for having me on. I haven't been as present online as I would like to be the past couple of weeks, but I'm glad I was able to actually do this podcast.
Great pleasure. It's been all ours. And guys, if you're listening, you can find Bryson Sullivan. I know you've already followed him at Natural Paradigm and his podcast, the Tech Heads podcast, or Tech Heads F1 on Twitter. So Bryson, I think that concludes a fantastic conversation. We'll have to have you back some way through the season. Really looking to whet our appetite for testing, and hopefully we release this episode maybe on the eve of testing so people can listen to it just before they turn on their TVs and watch these new cars take shape. Well, look, this has been the formidable, allegedly F1 Blag, your unusual co-host. It's been for me a very special episode of Jorgy'S Stripping and Dipping. Looking forward to hearing what you think of the episode. Please review us on YouTube, on your podcast provider, and drop us a line on Twitter at Strip the Dip. Until next time, see you soon. Good night.